Now.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we begin, I'd like to mention that Erin Hodson is the Indigenous Curriculum Specialist and Education Developer in Teaching and Learning here at Laurier. And we are just going to ask her a few questions regarding her experiences and thoughts on activism. Also, I'd like to mention that Nira Palma is absent today due to another school-related commitment, but she has prepared some of the questions we are asking today. On that note, if everybody is ready, I'll pass the torch on to Caitlin.
Thank you, Avery. So, Erin, our first question is, are you involved in Indigenous activism? And if so, what are some of the strategies or tools that you think are necessary to your activism and career at Laurier?
So I think where I come to my activism is in the work that I do. As the Indigenous curriculum specialist, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that job. And my activism comes in being in that place and space and making sure that I am creating as much space as possible for Indigenous ways of Indigenous ways of knowing and being at Laurier. I have engaged in activism in previous points in my life and in more traditional ways that we sort of think about activism. But I would also like to say that, you know, the simple fact of being alive is in my idea as an Indigenous person activism. Refusing to be silent, refusing to put my feathers down. That is a form of activism that many Indigenous people sort of need to really sort of recognize within themselves, that the simple fact that you are existing as an Indigenous person is a form of activism. Strategies and the tools that I think are necessary for activism is the strength to be able to be yourself and to ensure that you are living an authentic life and not segregating your culture from the rest of, you know, your professional life or your personal life. I refuse to segment myself in any way, shape, or form. So what you see is what you get. And it's a necessary tool in activism to sort of walk the good path while you are doing the work that you are doing. So for me, one of the strategies that I have is to rely on my cultural teachings, to spend time as much as possible in these strange times with community members and elders, and, you know, checking in with my community as much as I can, and really being of service, I think is one of the best tools that you can have as an activist.
Okay, awesome. Can you describe some of your roles and accomplishments as the Indigenous curriculum specialist at Laurier?
So my role is it's very interesting because it's first of all, I co-report. I fall under teaching and learning, but also the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, which I think is really fundamental for this job. You can't really do it if you are seconded or secluded in one area. You need to have that sort of by relationship with, you know, what you consider mainstream, but also the Indigenous portions of the institution you're working for. Indigenous curriculum specialists are very few and far between. It is a growing field. When I stepped into it, as far as I could tell, there was only 3 of us in Ontario. And I was the only one in Southern Ontario. So that to me is, first of all, it was really scary. Those were really big shoes to fill. But more and more institutions are seeing the importance of this job and making place and putting money toward jobs like this. So my role is really to be a support and a resource for faculty, staff, students, community, anyone who has questions about how to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing and being authentically into what they're doing. I will make sure that I am giving up my time and my space to be able to talk to them about that, because if I boil my job down to the most finite piece of it, my job is to make Laurier a better place for Indigenous students. So anything that I can do to make our students feel more supported and more comfortable and more safe here and more seen here, I will show up and do. I'm not sure accomplishments. I'm not sure what I would definitely say that. I would say that in terms of this role, one of my biggest accomplishments has been to feel comfortable living my truth and walking with my culture everywhere I go. It's very important to make sure that that I find it is very important to make sure that I model the behavior that I'm offering to other people. So I think that that would be one of my biggest accomplishments, is to sort of walk the walk as much as possible.
Yeah, amazing. What do you think the future holds for Indigenous peoples at Laurier and educational institutes?
That's a really good question. I think that that probably would have been a much easier question to answer pre-COVID. I think that the pandemic has really called into question educational practices in post-secondary institutions. I would like to think, and here's the thing about decolonization and indigenization. It is a very slow road. It's not something that's going to happen, I don't think, in my lifetime, but that doesn't mean that I don't put in my work to make things better for future people. I would like to hope that our institution and every other post-secondary institution's Indigenous numbers go up. Their enrollment numbers of Indigenous students, but also in hiring practices, not just in faculty, but in staff as well. We are not going to be able to make sustainable change unless there are more Indigenous people within the academy to support those changes, because we are very few and far between, and it makes it a lot of work for the people who are here. So I would like to hope that there will be more Indigenous faculty, that there will be more Indigenous staff, and that positions like myself will not be one-offs within teaching and learning, that there will be more of people doing the same types of work that I do within this institution, because it's a lot and I shouldn't be doing it alone, frankly.
How would you describe a good ally?
Oh, that's a big question, because there's a lot that goes into being called an ally. So I was actually doing a class last night that was about allyship, and first and foremost, you should not be calling yourself an ally. Ally is not a title that you should be using for yourself. That's something that other people bestow on you. It should not be worn as a badge of honor, but it should be seen as a really big, hard, scary, tiring job that you never step out of. Allyship is showing up every day and putting yourself on the line to say what you know to be true, but also being of service. A lot of self-reflection goes into being an ally. So why are you doing it? If you're not doing it for the right reasons, you shouldn't be doing it. And I think if I'm going to describe a really good ally, there needs to be a lot of self-reflection, constantly checking in with yourself about why you're doing it, about any sort of knee-jerk reactions that you have that sort of show where your implicit bias is, because we all walk around with implicit bias. Doing the work, doing the reading, doing the learning that needs to happen. And really just, making your life about being there for somebody else, to use the privilege and the power that you come to, regardless of how you come to it, to stand up for other people.
What do you think Laurier could do better for its Indigenous students and facility?
Facility or faculty? The faculty?
Faculty, my bad.
Just making sure I'm answering the right question. What can Laurier do for the Indigenous population that is connected to this institution? Goodness, so much. Hiring more Indigenous faculty, definitely. Hiring everything that I've ever read, the literature that I've seen, all of the practices that I have seen, cluster hires work really well. So it's when you hire a grouping of people at the same time so that they can support each other. Usually what happens at institutions is when a faculty member, an Indigenous faculty member, is hired, it's a one-off. They're the only Indigenous person within that faculty. So that means that they are doing, triple the work of everyone else, because they are on every committee as the sole Indigenous voice. They are expected to be on every research project, being the Indigenous spokesperson. Any graduate work that has to do with anything with Indigeneity, they're expected to be involved. But then on top of that, they have their own teaching that they have to do. They have their own research that they have to do. They have their own service that they have to do. And on top of that, they have community responsibilities, right? So it is a huge job to take on as a sole person within your institution as the Indigenous person. The more that we hire, the more people are going to be available for those things. And then they can support each other as well. I think for Indigenous students, I mean, that's a really hard one for me to answer, because I wouldn't really want to speak. There's so many different realities of Indigenous students. I think one of the things that would be much better for Indigenous students is more, and this is something we don't necessarily have time to get into at this point, but more funding that can be counted on. The funding that Indigenous student centers get across the province is per year. So every year, every Indigenous student center within a post-secondary institution in Ontario, they have to reapply for funding from the provincial government. So that means that they cannot expect funding, that there's always a chance that they might not get the funding that they need. And a lot of jobs and salaries are tied to that money as well. So there's a lot of trouble getting any sort of momentum going, because every year you sort of feel like you have to start again. So yearly funding, I think, from institutions, not from the government, would be really great. I think that Laurier does do some pretty good stuff. Well, and it's not really Laurier that does it, though. It's the Indigenous Student Center. The Indigenous Student Center does a lot of work to ensure that our students are as supported as possible. I know that Laurier is looking to hire an Indigenous counselor, which I think is a great step. We are currently looking for a AVP of Indigenous initiatives, which is fantastic. So I think more funding, always, more money. It always boils down to more money, right? But also ensuring that there is enough classes for Indigenous studies on both campuses, so that students who want to learn can learn. And there is a lot more that the institution can be doing, but it sort of is a lot more finite and sort of tricky to talk about. So I think funding for Indigenous students and for Indigenous student supports would be wonderful.
And then last question, what is one thing you want the student population to know about the Indigenous population in Waterloo/Laurier?
First of all, that we exist, I think, is a really big one. I think that there is a very well-held understanding that Indigenous people don't really, like, the Indigenous people aren't here. When I first started this job, I was contacted by, the CEO, I believe, somebody who was in charge of the Kitchener Art Museum, I believe it is. And she had seen that I had been hired and that I had come from Brock University, and she had worked at Brock University at one point. So she asked if I wanted to go out for lunch. We went out for lunch. It was very lovely. She's a very fantastic woman. And she said to me, at Brock University, particularly in the Niagara region, the Indigenous population is very active. But we also have the supports that are required for that activism. And there's a very strong relationship with Brock University and the Indigenous population. There's a lot of community work that goes along there. So she was used to that sort of that engagement and the very visual representation of Indigenous people, whether it's within artwork or any sort of tangible iconography. Those sorts of things really are very prominent within St. Catharines and Brock University. So when she got here, she asked somebody, so like, where are all the Indigenous people? Like, how do we connect with them? We need to, start working with them and that sort of thing. And the gentleman looked at her and said, oh, we don't have those here. And she was like, no, I'm sure you do. Pretty sure you do. You just don't know it because they don't show up in their buckskin dresses with their feathers on every day. So I think if there is one thing that I would like the student population to know about Indigenous populations in this area is that, first of all, we are here, regardless if you think that you see us or not, and that we have existed here since time immemorial, that we have a longstanding history in this area, that if you don't know about things like the Haldeman Tract and the Two-Row Wampum and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, you need to start doing some reading and learning about these things. But also that, we do fun stuff. It's not all, making sure your histories and the really, the not so pretty stuff. Like, we have powwows. There's at least 2 powwows, maybe 3 powwows in this area every summer or every year. There will be one, and I'm not sure, pre-COVID. I'm not sure during COVID what it's going to look like, but I know that Conestoga College has a midwinter powwow every year. That the University of Waterloo also holds a powwow in September. In normal times, there are soup lunches every Tuesday at the Indigenous Student Center where you can go and have free lunch. You just walk in, somebody hands you a bowl of soup and it's all homemade. There are these fun things that you can do as well. I want the student population at Laurier to know that the Indigenous Student Center, while they definitely are mandated to support Indigenous students, they do have a lot of programming that they do that non-Indigenous people can get into, and it's fun, and we're fun, and we're funny, and the more that there is engagement with Indigenous people, the more that there's going to be an understanding of what we bring that is positive to the table as well. How was that? Was that good?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Wonderful.
So at this time, I would like to take a moment and thank you for joining us. On behalf of myself, Avery, Caitlin, and Niropama, we recognize that you are very busy and truly appreciate your time. We enjoyed listening to your insights, knowledge, and your work surrounding Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful humans. I very much appreciate the time. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.